Hey everybody, it is Palm Sunday and it's time for Corona Story Time. My name's Dave, and Kara and I have a friend named Sean Gladding who's written a collection of stories for Holy Week called A View from the Margins. You can get it as a Kindle ebook, and I'm going to read a portion from the Palm Sunday entry. Here we go. Perhaps you're reading this before you join your church and worship this Palm Sunday. If so, it's quite possible you'll hear a sermon about Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Perhaps you'll sing one of the rousing hymns we often sing today. Hosanna, loud Hosanna, or all glory, laud, and honor. There may well be a parade down the center aisle involving children and a few reluctant adults waving palm branches. Palm Sunday often brings with it a festive atmosphere, and rightly so. In Luke's Gospel, we've been waiting for this moment for 10 chapters, from verse 9:51, where Luke declares that Jesus resolutely set his face to go to Jerusalem. And now, here is Jesus about to enter the great city, the site of the temple, which even now is preparing for the arrival of the pilgrim crowds, which will swell the city's population to overflowing. Jerusalem was a tinderbox at Passover. The people gathered to celebrate their ancestors' deliverance from the tyranny of Pharaoh, to relive the events of the Exodus, all under the watchful gaze of the Roman soldiers drafted in to keep the peace. You can almost taste the resentment in the air, but resentment blended with hope, the hope that God will finally act to deliver you from your enemies. Would this be the year when Messiah came to the temple? Would this be the year when the long-awaited king of the line of David would overthrow the tyranny of your oppressors? That appears to be what the crowds on the road up to Jerusalem believed was happening. Matthew, in his telling of the story, makes the case explicitly by quoting the prophet Zechariah. Behold, your king is coming, gentle and mounted on a donkey, even on a colt. And that is what appears to have infuriated the Pharisees, who tell Jesus to silence his followers. Certainly they don't believe that Jesus is the long-awaited Messiah. And it's one thing for these peasants to make claims about Jesus in the villages of Galilee. It is another thing entirely for them to do so in Jerusalem. It's one thing for them to speak against the Romans in their homes in the hills. It's another thing entirely to do so in the shadow of the eagle standards raised in Jerusalem. No, tell your people to be quiet, Jesus. This kind of behavior is unacceptable and dangerous. One of the primary ways people are marginalized is by denying them their voice, by telling them to be quiet, to know their place. And so whenever the marginalized and oppressed dare to raise their voices in protest of their lived experience, in hope of change, there are always people who want them to be quiet. People who, like the Pharisees, instruct the leaders among the oppressed to find another way for them to express their protest, one that is more acceptable, one that doesn't inconvenience others who may not share their views, one that respects the tight parameters permitted for protest. Or, better yet, for them to just go home and wait patiently for change to come. Well, the people on the road to Jerusalem that day had waited for change to come for centuries. They had suffered under the boot of one empire after another, as well as at the hands of their own leadership, who often collaborated with the might of empire to maintain their own privileged position. So when they saw the rabbi from Galilee who talked of a new kingdom that was coming, who taught them with stories rooted in their own experience of life, a rabbi who stood in solidarity with them, the poor, the diseased, the outcast, the despised, how could they keep quiet as they accompanied him to the city where they would celebrate God's deliverance of their oppressed ancestors? But even if they were to stop singing, Jesus responds to the critique of the Pharisees. If these do become silent, I tell you, the stones will cry out. As we begin Holy Week, the invitation before us is to move to the margins, to see Jesus from a different perspective, as well as to look around us from that decentered place. Most of us picture ourselves in that crowd, waving palm branches, throwing our jackets into the road ahead of Jesus, celebrating the King who rides on the back of that young boy's colt. Personally, I'm always up for the parade down the center aisle on Palm Sunday. But am I also up for joining the crowds protesting systemic injustice today, to stand in solidarity with those who speak out against their plight, especially when those crowds engage in behavior with which I may not be comfortable? As the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. observed in a speech he gave just 3 weeks before he was assassinated, a riot is the language of the unheard. The authorities in Jerusalem always feared riots during Passover. They knew any unrest would bring down the wrath of Rome upon their heads, as well as threaten the stability of the societal order, which, after all, worked very well for them. No, say those with power. If people feel they are treated unjustly, there are appropriate channels for them to go through to express their concerns. Channels often created by and overseen by the very people with whom those suffering injustice have concerns. Dr. King was jailed in 1963 following a nonviolent protest against segregation in Birmingham, Alabama. 8 white clergymen made a public statement against him, describing the protest as unwise, untimely, and extreme. Dr. King wrote the now famous Letter from Birmingham Jail in response, in which he decries those who are more devoted to order than to justice, who prefer a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. Teacher, tell your disciples to be quiet. I tell you, if they become silent, the stones by the roadside will cry out. All right, that's it. And Sean has posted an examine, spiritual exercise to follow your read of each day's chapter. So look for that book. Have a great Palm Sunday. We'll see you next time.